Our webinar today is called Strengthening Relationships Between Non-Custodial Fathers and the Mothers of Their Children. So the Institute for Research on Poverty, or IRP, is based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the sole national poverty research center funded by ASPE at the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And the Prevention Board is a state agency that advances statewide policy, public awareness, and evidence-informed programming to strengthen families and reduce the likelihood of child abuse and neglect, and it seeks to address those goals through the mobilization of research and best practices. Our presenters today are Tova Walsh and Daryl Davidson. Walsh is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is also a research affiliate of IRP. And Davidson is the men's health manager for the city of Milwaukee. We'll have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about our presenters in just a moment here, but Tova and Daryl, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
I also want to acknowledge the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services for their support of this webinar series from the IRP side. That said, any views expressed in today's webinar don't necessarily reflect any positions of ASPE, the Institute for Research on Poverty, or the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board. So with that, Tova and Daryl, thank you again for being here. And if I may, can I invite the two of you to tell us a little bit more about your background and your perspectives in coming at this work?
Thanks, Dave. So I'm Tova Walsh. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at UW-Madison, as Dave told you. The way I came to focus on strengthening engagement of fathers with their children and engagement of fathers within social services really grows out of my background as a home visitor. So I worked with families during pregnancy and with children birth to 3 years old. And in that work, I got really interested in thinking about how we could do more to engage fathers. I was working with programs that primarily operated and trained folks to work with mothers and babies, and I wanted to think more about how we could do better in terms of our engagement of dads and support for whole families. So my current research focuses on early parent-child relationships and interventions to strengthen parent-child relationships with an emphasis on thinking about how we engage fathers effectively in services, and particularly how we engage fathers in the perinatal period to set up strong trajectories of involvement and support strong relationships across the life course. I'll turn it over to you, Daryl, to tell us a little bit about yourself, too.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Daryl Davidson. Presently, I'm a part of our component at our City of Milwaukee Health Department dealing with policy, strategy, and innovation. And 2 years ago, I became the manager of the home visiting program for men, specifically the Direct Assistance to Dads project, which addresses many of the issues that most of us firmly believe are very important as far as father engagement. Prior to that, I had certifications in AODA and substance abuse counseling and treatment, as well as tobacco cessation and domestic violence intervention through batterers intervention training activities. Our connection to fatherhood at the City of Milwaukee Health Department came through initially our men's health unit, which is a one-stop shop for men and addresses many of the issues that men typically deal with related to health, related to life expectancy, but ultimately service needs assessments are a part of it, and they do receive information from us as well as guidance from the referrals that we get from a large network of partners called our Men's Health Referral Network. And what we did see as we went through the last 10 years, we overwhelmingly saw an increase in the number of single fathers. So a variety of circumstances, a variety of incomes, but mostly low-income fathers of color who were now responsible for taking care of the children, and it still matches the rise of single fathers that we saw in the data related to the Pew Research Center. So we'd like to talk to you more about that, too.
Great. Thanks so much, Daryl. So I'm going to just walk you through where we're headed in this webinar. First, we're going to provide a little bit of background information about the importance of father involvement to child development. Then we're going to talk about the dynamics of co-parenting relationships, the importance of co-parenting relationships to non-custodial father involvement. We'll discuss strategies for service providers to engage mothers and fathers and promote effective co-parenting. And then we'll have some pro tips. So Daryl will be weighing in throughout, but in particular when we get to pro tips, you're going to hear some of the great things that he has learned through the work that he does. And then we'll move into questions and discussion. And as Dave said, many of you submitted questions as part of registration, and we will get to some of those in the webinar, some of them at the end. We probably will not be able to address all of the questions that were asked. We were delighted to receive hundreds of questions, and so we're not going to get to all of them in this hour, but we hope to hit on many of them that will be interesting and important for us to discuss, and we apologize if we're not able to get to your questions, but we will also take them back to think about and inform future programming. So moving into some background information, I just want to start by defining father involvement. And so from a research perspective, we think about this in terms of 3 dimensions. So positive engagement is the direct interaction that fathers have with their children. So that includes things like playing, reading, singing, all kinds of shared activities. Accessibility is about fathers' availability to their children and responsiveness. And then responsibility is about participation in decision-making and ensuring that children are cared for. So things like scheduling doctor's appointments or making child care arrangements. This work, some of this early work to develop that model was by Michael Lamb and colleagues, and more recent work expands on that. We think about it in terms of direct and indirect care, so things like financial providing are indirect, where direct is things like caregiving and play. And then research is also showing that the quality of father involvement is really critical. So the time that fathers spend with their children certainly matters, but also how they're spending that time and the kinds of quality of relationships that fathers are able to develop and maintain with their children. And this is so important because across a variety of domains, we see that positive father involvement is associated with benefits to children. So we see gains, we see things like higher academic achievement, greater school readiness, greater emotional security, fewer behavioral problems, a host of positive outcomes associated with positive father involvement. And this extends from, as early as positive father involvement during pregnancy makes a difference, during infancy, through childhood, adolescence, and even into adulthood, really lasting effects. Positive father involvement not only benefits children, it benefits mothers and fathers themselves. So women with supportive partners have fewer health problems in pregnancy. We see that the quality of mothering that mothers are able to provide to an infant is associated with the support that they receive from the father. The quality of the partner relationship is associated with how both mother and father will nurture and respond to the needs of their child. And then in terms of benefits to fathers, we see heightened sense of parental competence, greater satisfaction with parenthood when fathers have opportunity to be really involved with their children. From a service perspective, we see that father involvement in programming is associated with improved outcomes. So this we see in a number of child and family services, so things like permanency planning and parenting training in Head Start and in schools. When fathers are involved, it's associated with improved child outcomes. And so we'll move from there into our topic for today and thinking about the dynamics of co-parenting relationships. So first we want to just talk a little bit about what is a co-parenting relationship. So the co-parenting relationship is really critical because it influences the quality of the parent-child relationship and child well-being as well. And mothers and fathers have a co-parenting relationship, whether they are living together or not living together. Today we're going to be focusing in particular on non-resident fathers and non-custodial fathers whose access to their kids may really depend on the relationship that they are able to maintain with the custodial parent. We're going to talk about the importance of the quality of that co-parenting relationship and talk about some of the different dimensions of these relationships, which can be positive and negative depending on kind of the balance of cooperation and conflict in these relationships. So some factors that are associated with the quality of the co-parenting relationship include the history of the relationship between the parents, relationships with new partners, human capital and economic resources, and race and ethnicity. All of these across a variety of studies have been shown to be associated with the quality of the co-parenting relationship. So some studies, for example, have shown higher quality co-parenting among African American parents. Some studies have shown that parents' human capital is associated with particular trajectories of co-parenting over time. And one of the things we'll talk about next is thinking about which factors are associated with lower declining levels of co-parenting, the families where you might really need to provide support if you are working with with one or the other or both parents. So some of the factors that we see in the research that are associated with lower declining levels of co-parenting include a low-quality relationship at the time of the child's birth, include dissolution or ending of the relationship that was unilateral, so where one partner really motivated the end of the relationship and the other kind of feels dissatisfied with that. Mother's repartnering is associated with risk for lower declining levels of co-parenting. Father's multi-partnered fertility, low social support for parents, and noncompliance with child support. And I'm going to pause here because, Daryl, I think you wanted to say a little bit about risk for lower declining levels of co-parenting.
I did, because what seems to be key, as many of us would know, that it's about communication, but sometimes the individuals would need some guidance on what good communication would look like. We'd have to start off with letting the parents know that co-parenting has nothing to do with the parents, really. Parents are the secondary part of the equation. It's the child. It's the child. It's not the other parent. The relationship may not have worked out because there might have been specific conversations that related between the two parents, so they would have to consistently agree that certain parts of those conversations should not be spoken about in front of the child, and perhaps make it even forbidden. Another thing to consider is if it's co-parenting, then it should be something that's consistent. It's not going to be erratic. It has to be detailed out. So basically what the parents have to consider doing now is treating their relationship just like it's a worker-co-worker relationship. They have to agree on what are the consistencies, the rules and the curfews and the bedtimes and the screen times, and making sure that when they present the rules that it does not reflect anything about the child has no influence on changing the rules, and it's obviously not a competition. So it's not a matter of who's going to be more fun, who's not, who's going to be the disciplinarian, who's not. But both parents have to have those particular skills each time the child is going to see either one of them separately.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daryl. So that's just a reminder as we're thinking about this to keep, that ultimately this is about centering the interests and needs of the children, and that when, if the focus is on, if parents are engaging too much around kind of whether it's kind of bad memories or historically stuff that's been difficult between them, that adds to the conflict, and then coming together, and you described it so nicely, thinking about this as a working together relationship in the interest of the child is really kind of where we're headed as we get into talking about ways of building stronger co-parenting relationships. So this next slide comes from research conducted by the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network, and FRPN, as they're known, is one of the organizations that we'll provide a link to at the end as a resource to check out. But in some research that they have done to really define co-parenting and think about how you measure it, they've identified 6 dimensions of the co-parenting relationship. So they talk about support, or the degree to which fathers feel supported by the mother of the target child, and so this is research that has been done with dads, but this is could be used reciprocally, and you could think about it also in terms of co-parenting from the perspective of the mother. They talk about agreement, so this is the consistency that Daryl was just talking about, the extent to which fathers and mothers have similar goals and beliefs concerning child rearing, and it might be about things like screen time or eating bedtimes, the kinds of things that you might need to figure out together. Then there's another dimension that they call alliance, and that's thinking about the ways in which parents are able to collaborate and make efforts to understand one another. And then, so these first 3 dimensions clearly are the more positive dimensions or cooperative aspects of co-parenting, and then these final 3 are kind of negative or conflict-driven aspects. So one is undermining, so father's perceptions regarding whether the mother actively attempts to interfere with the father-child relationship, gatekeeping being mother's efforts to deny father's access, and conflict being a range of struggles including verbal disputes as well as physical violence. And again, this is framed in terms of measuring co-parenting from the perspective of fathers, but if you're working with both parents or if you're working with mothers and thinking about co-parenting issues, you could think about the flip side of this as well. And so they've developed a scale that goes along with this. If you were ever looking to measure co-parenting, each of these scales gets assessed with items where parents rate on a scale of 1 to 5, indicating how strongly they agree or not with their ability to achieve these goals. So an example might be, the mother of my child tells me I'm doing a good job or otherwise lets me know I'm being a good father, and that's one of the support items that would get rated in this scale. So this next slide presents some research findings from the Parents and Child Together evaluation. That's a multi-year evaluation that is measuring the impacts and implementation of 4 fatherhood programs that received grants from the Department of Health and Human Services, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And so they received these 3-year grants in 2011. The grants ended in 2015 after a 1-year extension. And this is one piece of the findings, and there's a link at the bottom of this slide to more information about the results of this evaluation. But one of the things that comes out of this evaluation is that they really found several different kind of profiles or patterns of engagement between parents who were no longer in a relationship. And so they characterized one set of families as, or one set of co-parents as cooperative, another set as conflicted, and another set as disengaged. And so the distinction between conflicted and disengaged is, conflicted is low levels of cooperation with high levels of conflict. The disengaged group is low levels of cooperation and low levels of conflict because a parent has really kind of checked out. And so coming out of this, they offer some recommendations, including, offering services to help fathers to navigate and potentially improve their relationships with their moms. They also talk about helping non-resident dads to obtain the legal agreements that can structure and support greater involvement with their children. And then, another thing this really points toward is not, assuming any one thing when we hear that people are co-parenting and that parents are separated and figuring out how to work together. They show, that there are really these different patterns of engagement, and understanding for a specific family, what the pattern is useful to inform efforts of service providers to support parents. So now we're going to talk about the importance of co-parenting relationships to non-custodial father involvement. And we want to just frame this a little bit by, thinking about the scope of non-custodial fathers. First in Wisconsin, the state where both Daryl and I are located, and then we'll talk about this nationally. And we're glad to have an audience that includes both a number of Wisconsin people and a number of people from across the country. So we'll put this in both contexts. All told, about 1/3 of all U.S. and Wisconsin children experience their parents' divorce before they reach age 18. And many other children might experience the separation of their never married parents. So in Wisconsin, about over 16,000 children experience their parents' divorce each year. Close to 40% of births are to unmarried mothers, and about 1/3 of children living in single-parent households. And as we move on, Daryl will talk also, he was saying about the work that they're doing, and how increasingly often they are now seeing single-father households where fathers are the primary parents. So we'll talk about that, as well as non-custodial fathers. In a U.S. context, there are about 2 million single fathers in the U.S. Close to 10 million children live in homes without fathers present. 40% of births, so not so different than Wisconsin in these U.S. statistics, 40% of births to unmarried mothers, and a little over 1/3 of children living in a single-parent household. So now the question, so we've got a sense of the scope of non-resident fathers, and then the question is, how involved are non-resident fathers? The key takeaway, and so it's in red italics up there where you can't miss it, is that there's really wide variation, so being careful not to make assumptions when we're working with non-resident fathers about how involved they might be. In one study, and the source is listed at the bottom, but this is a study that included 582 fathers who were recruited from fatherhood programs and other locations in low-income neighborhoods in 6 northeastern cities. And they described, and this is self-report about the kinds of involvement that they have with their children with whom they are not living. More than 40% reported hugging children more than once a week. More than 30% reported going for walks more than once per week. Over 40% reported sharing meals more than once per week. But also about 1/3 of the fathers in this sample reported not having engaged in these activities at all during the past month. So you can see that there's pretty big variation. Over 80% of fathers reported in the past month having, phone, written, email, social media contact with their kids. So even among those who were not seeing their kids very frequently, they were also describing, other kinds of engagement. And then non-resident fathers in this sample reported really substantial involvement in decision-making regarding some aspects of their child's rearing. So they talked about involvement in things like deciding how much money is spent on things like children's clothing. They talked about a role in deciding how children are disciplined, but they reported less involvement in decisions regarding where children attend school or daycare. So across the items in this particular study, there was pretty wide variation in the ways in which fathers were involved. Maybe I'll pause there to just ask, Daryl, would you want to add anything in terms of what you see with the fathers you work with when you're working with non-resident fathers, how you see involvement playing out?
I do. One of the major sources of discontent has been the fathers may not be employed, or the former partner might be saying that the father is not keeping up with child support or making payments on time. And what we're seeing is that if there is an arrangement, if the relationship for the most part is still working out where the non-custodial father is able to see the child, often it's not a matter of just putting the money in. There's exposing the child to a lot of discipline and work-oriented behaviors. So socializing the child around, not just helping out with the housework at his home environment, but also even participating in volunteer activities. Maybe those are volunteer activities at the schools, within the community, and even showing children how to solve problems. Letting the non-custodial parent know that those things are going on. Letting the custodial parent know that those things are going on, as well as keeping them up to date on any changes that take place, including obviously change of address, phone number or email, and making sure to be consistent with the planning. So both parents have the ability to say, I know that this was the weekend that you were supposed to have the child, but something is going on. You know, there might be an event, there may be sports activities, and not letting that overshadow the fact that you are still going to be with the child. Maybe there's going to be some changes, but over time, those things are going to even out. And it does not have to be a 50-50 split. Even though you're saying it's co-parenting, it's not always going to be even-steven every weekend.
Thanks, Daryl. That's actually a really great point that you made at the end there in terms of co-parenting not implying 50-50, that it could look different and it can vary over time, and there might be aspects of involvement that are shared pretty equally and then other aspects that are less so. So even for dads who might have less than 50% time that they're spending with their kids, there could be opportunity to be a full partner and co-parent in some of the decision making. So yeah, so lots of variation in how this can look. So why is co-parenting important? We've talked about this a little bit, but let's just dig in a little bit more. First is to say that exposure to stress between parents, to parental stress and conflict, is the greatest predictor of outcomes for children who experience their parents' divorce or separation. So it's less so the divorce or separation itself than the response of parents and what children are exposed to during that transition. So there is, research that shows when children move from a, conflict-ridden or neglecting family situation to one where, things are more stable and parents are getting along better, they actually have better outcomes following the separation and divorce. So really part of the key question here is, how much we can limit children's exposure to conflict. And then there's research that shows that improving co-parenting and interventions that strengthen co-parenting has a positive impact on multiple dimensions of children's adjustment and well-being. So that might include school performance, emotional well-being, behavioral problems, but these things can improve over time as the co-parenting relationship is strengthened. A little bit more on why co-parenting is important. So for non-resident fathers, involvement is closely tied to the quality of the father's relationship with other family members, especially with the mother. There's research that suggests that mothers' perceptions of the paternal role are a better predictor of paternal engagement than father's perceptions, which is linked really to the idea of gatekeeping. So when mothers perceive the importance of father's role and want to support that's a strong predictor of paternal engagement. And then co-parenting has been associated with non-resident fathers' continued engagement and financial support of their children. When the quality of that relationship is stronger, that's associated with more engagement and greater financial support. And this relationship is particularly important for mothers and fathers when these are never married, non-resident parents or adolescent fathers. So that association stands for all kinds of co-parenting relationships, but the strength is even more so. The quality of co-parenting relationships is even more significant for fathers' continued engagement in the case of never married, non-resident fathers and adolescent fathers. And so now we're going to move into talking about strategies for service providers to engage mothers and fathers and promote effective co-parenting. And the first set of strategies we're going to talk about, we're going to start with some general strategies that are oriented towards increasing engagement of fathers, and then we're going to speak more specifically about the goal of strengthening co-parenting and in particular increasing engagement of non-resident fathers. But so some general strategies for increasing engagement of fathers that are relevant here include being sure as a service provider that you're communicating with fathers, including non-resident fathers, recognizing their parenting role, providing outreach, extending personal invitation to fathers to participate in services, addressing practical barriers like adjusting the schedule to meet the family's needs. So if there's a program in which you're trying to engage the family, making sure that even if the services are initiated through the mother, if you're wanting to engage the father, that you learn what you can about what it would take for him to be there and try to make it as accessible as possible. Creating a father-friendly environment, so that involves things like providing a warm welcome, knowing a father's name and greeting him by name, offering materials that are meant for fathers and images of fathers so that, when fathers see brochures or program materials or, what the waiting room looks like in a particular service setting, that they're seeing themselves represented and not getting the message that this is a program that's intended for mothers and maybe it's not really for me. Presuming high interest, so, starting from a place of recognizing that, fathers, for the most part, really want to be highly engaged with their children and have positive relationships, and starting from that place, and reinforcing fathers' contributions. Some additional general strategies for increasing the engagement of fathers. Think about who reaches out, who's providing the services, who participates. So when possible, having fathers reaching out to other fathers or male program staff, attending to having some programming where fathers are not outnumbered, so that if you're providing group-based programs, it's not, a lone father in a program that is primarily serving mothers might feel kind of isolated. Offering events for fathers and children together, making sure that we learn what fathers want and offer it. So if we, haven't asked, starting by, getting some input from fathers in the community about what kind of programming they would find compelling and would show up for. Learning about and responding to fathers' individual circumstances, and we recognized before that there's really wide variation in fathers' involvement, wide variation in fathers' relationships to children's mothers. So learning about and really being sensitive to fathers' individual circumstances, offering resources to fathers to help them achieve their parenting and related goals. Collaborating with other providers as needed, and taking advantage of moments of opportunity when fathers might be seeking services and open and receptive to engaging. Daryl, is there anything that you would want to add in terms of general strategies for increasing engagement of fathers? You certainly, with the DAD program, are really centered on engaging fathers. Anything that you would add here?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I would want to remind people to do is try to be flexible in your scheduling, because often men can't attend for a variety of reasons. If they're working, it's also because they might be looking for work. It's a possibility that you might be able to find mentors for those fathers and volunteers if you make it flexible, make it in the early evening and sometimes on weekend. Also know that if you have a program that's specifically focused on men, your numbers are not necessarily saying that it's success. You're going to celebrate success when a few men show up, and then you can build on the reputation. So don't be discouraged if not that many men show up during your first few meetings. If you only have 3 or 4, perfectly fine. Eventually, over time, when you get your reputation, it will start to grow. And also, make sure to do some evaluating consistently. Find out not only what the men want, but if the men are able to pass that survey on to the mothers, make sure that you find out what types of things the moms may want in those types of sessions that might be able to benefit them. Let's say strengthening a co-parenting relationship activity might be a part of the session. And if you're an agency or provider who has hosted events primarily for the mom, one thing to consider, if you want to host events regularly for the mom and for the dad separately, you should probably consider doing the event for the dads first, because if you develop a reputation for it only being for the mother, then the dads probably aren't going to come. But if you start off early and say, we want the fathers, you know, the very first session that you do, and then after that, the moms will generally come anyway if that's how you are running your sessions. Those are a few things.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the reminders. You know, my practice background is working with organizations that primarily were serving mothers, and we're trying to innovate and expand their engagement of fathers, and it's really valuable to hear, you know, your perspective from programs that work with fathers, that it can work in the other direction too. So starting from fathers, thinking about how to engage mothers and how to support co-parenting from that direction. The other thing I would just mention that, you know, that occurred to me as you were talking, Daryl, you know, the other thing that I've heard in my research is when you think about offering programs for parents, you know, fathers will often tell me that they really need to hear explicitly that this is a program for, you know, mothers and fathers, or to hear the word father in it, because they've sort of had the experience enough times of things that are kind of parenting programs but that are really mothers programs, where they end up feeling not sure of their place, that really naming and being explicit if we're wanting to engage fathers is important, so that they know that they are really welcome in the intended audience for the services.
I agree with you there. And as a matter of fact, I keep saying that it doesn't even matter if all of the providers are male. That's not the most important aspect of this. You just have to make sure that you're saying this particular event or these activities are father-specific or male-specific, and ultimately make sure that you get the information from them on what is their definition of being father-friendly. So does it have to be the space, the location? Is it a matter of the time? What about the color scheme or the type of room that you're in? Maybe you need to do it outside. So get the information from them about what they want and make that a consistent practice.
Great. So some additional practical strategies for increasing engagement of fathers. You know, a piece of this is placing value on fathers and their role. So whether you are working with fathers and mothers, you know, being clear to recognize the role of fathers and framing fathers' engagement around, you know, benefits to both mothers and children as well as to fathers themselves. Prioritizing father engagement from the beginning so that it doesn't feel, you know, like an add-on or as though it's being treated as secondary or optional. Facilitating understanding among service providers of how mothers may act as gatekeepers, so recognizing you know, the potential for that and how to engage both mothers and fathers in ways that you know, facilitate access. Working collaboratively with mothers to identify and change behaviors and communication strategies that might hinder fathers' engagement. So if you're working primarily with mothers, working with mothers around the engagement of fathers and thinking about what's been working or not working, and if fathers aren't participating in services, you know, what might be underlying that and how to support their engagement through kind of more positive communication, and providing culturally sensitive service models as well. And so we're going to move now into talking about some specific strategies for engaging non-resident fathers. And so one piece of this is recognizing the wide differences between involvement of residential and non-residential fathers, and attending, you know, demonstrating awareness of the differences and the different access that fathers might have, and being responsive to individual fathers' circumstances. And at the same time showing awareness that non-residential fathers may be highly involved. So recognizing that non-residential fathers may have reduced access to their children, but not going from there to making assumptions about their level of involvement, recognizing that they might be highly involved in learning from an individual father about his relationships with his children and his involvement and any constraints or barriers that he faces. Focusing on co-parenting relationships, you know, so fatherhood programs, when non-resident fathers are part of these programs, really want there to be a focus not just on father-child relationships, but on co-parenting relationships, recognizing how important these are to their opportunity to have the kind of father-child relationships they want to have. And so, you know, assessments and services should really address specific mother-father pairs. If a father has children with more than one partner and has more than one co-parenting relationship that he's navigating, recognizing that the different co-parenting relationships might be quite different, and so learning about his circumstances and responding to that. And then including fathers in existing activities, so parenting-focused programs, co-parenting-focused programs, but also offering activities focused on fathers and their personal development. So non-resident fathers, and actually fathers of all kinds in the research talk about also what it means to have programming that is centered on fathers that might provide things like training or education, literacy, support with seeking employment, that those kinds of services are also part of the bigger picture of supporting fathers to have the kinds of family relationships that they would like to have. Some additional strategies for engaging non-resident fathers. So reducing barriers to engagement, and this relates to what we talked about before in terms of father-friendly, and Daryl made the point of understanding what that means to fathers so that we can provide it. Also, to really normalize father engagement by reframing gender expectations. So if we are communicating in some way that that typically these are programs for mothers, or mothers show up, and that we don't have an expectation that fathers would want to show up and be highly involved, that's going to be a barrier. So part of it is, communicating, normalizing father engagement, recognizing it where it occurs, and valuing it is part of this. Using peers as a resource, so kind of father-to-father strategies where we create opportunities from fathers to learn from other fathers who have kind of been in their shoes and understand the challenges from that perspective. Highlighting the importance of father involvement with tangible, recognizable outcomes in children. So really coming back always to this being centered on children's needs and interests and what the benefits are to children, so that even when there is conflict between fathers and mothers, fathers are able to kind of, recenter and always come back to that this is important to their children, and so it's important to them. And tailoring services to increase comfort. So again, that is about learning what fathers are looking for and what is working or not working about the program that you might be offering to make it, a comfortable space for fathers. So as we're going to talk a little bit about some specific skills to support positive co-parenting, and these next couple of slides are based on co-parenting classes that are offered through the University of Wisconsin Extension. And the examples, the skills that are taught in these classes are really representative of what many co-parenting programs emphasize. So we'll use this as an example. There's a link on this page to where you can learn more about these particular programs, and they offer support at this link for people who want to develop and deliver programs of their own. There's some really excellent guidance available here about the important elements of programming and how you start to develop and design and recruit fathers and engage fathers as well as mothers in co-parenting programs. But so, if we come back to where we started, that the co-parenting relationship just makes the biggest difference in child outcomes, going from there, the really hopeful part, I would say, is that, there's also research that shows that co-parenting knowledge and skills can be taught, and that relationships that start off high in conflict can really shift and improve, and that interventions like these co-parenting classes can really make a difference to parents who are trying to, rebuild or build a strong relationship in the interests of their children. And so some of the elements, some of the skills that get taught in these classes, so a piece of it is about learning to protect your children from conflict. So when there is conflict, keeping it away from children's eyes and ears, avoiding that exposure for children. Learning to avoid putting children in the middle of adult relationships. Learning a more business-like, emotionally neutral style of communication with the other parent. This relates a little bit to what Daryl said about thinking about this more as like a colleague relationship where you're working together. So thinking about how you create this new way of communicating and approach to problem solving that is really, constructive and more neutral, and has to involve setting aside, where there has been kind of a history of a more emotional or fraught way of relating to one another. And then learning to support the ex-partner's parental role rather than undercutting them in the child's eyes. So even if there are differences that are between you when it comes to talking to your child, finding the ways to support the efforts that your former partner is making, and recognize the importance of their parenting role. And so I'm going to pause there. Daryl, would you like to add anything about specific skills to support positive co-parenting?
Yes, a couple of things that had come to mind. I knew that often parents and children, they are going to experience stress, and it's extremely uncomfortable to have many of the topics that come to mind in this conversation, but find a way to laugh. Find something that's funny in some of the activities that we're talking about, some of the things that we're doing. We also want to make sure that if you are a caseworker or a service provider, that you're respecting the culture of the individuals that you're working with. And often that'll take some time where people will have to go through training, so they'll be aware of some of the perceptions of men in certain communities and what the roles are, so that they don't overstep their bounds and make considerations about what men should do in a particular situation or what they should do in an environment. Once again, this also means that it's going to rely on us to listen to what the men are saying. And don't forget, many men will listen to men from their community. If we can find groups of men where they can provide positive role modeling or give guidance to other men, then let them be the GPS system. Our job a lot of times is to make sure that we're having program success. So we're clear about what our objectives are. We're clear about what the matrix are and the outcomes and the goals and the tasks. But often what we won't do, we won't go to all these different informal support systems. It could be the local community center or a church, or even some group that could have been an appropriate referral source that has the skills in another area that just happen to be appropriate skills that a father should learn. So that would be communication, or any types of conflict resolution. So those types of things go into co-parenting, and they may not necessarily have the heading co-parenting, but those are the types of activities and skills that the parents should be introduced to.
Thank you. So some really important points there, and I'll just say it again to underscore. Daryl mentioned both being responsive to the father's culture and also the importance of adding humor. That those elements are so important. So now we know there are these skills and knowledge that can be taught, but there's also how that gets delivered, and being understanding and learning from fathers about how they in context would about the way that they would respond in a situation, what would make them comfortable. Being responsive in that way is really critical, but also having it be funny can often, I think, be a difference between a father returning to the next session or not, if there's both kind of sensitivity to his needs, but also some humor that makes it a little less pedantic, so it's not just, you're not drilling these skills in a way that feels like you're being lectured or talked at. But if it's humorous, and there's lots of humor to be found in parenting, I think that is, as you were saying, just a really important way of making this kind of programming accessible and feel kind of meaningful, important, and not just like a class that's a burden, but actually like a place where you would want to be, where you're learning something that is valuable for your children. So with that in mind, with the skills and knowledge that get taught in these classes, this next slide shows the outcomes that are associated, or the impacts of this type of co-parenting intervention. And so the first column shows what some of the shorter term outcomes are. Second is medium term, and then on the right is, far right, is the longer term outcomes. And I won't read through all of these, but just want to highlight kind of how this progression looks. So it starts with increasing parents' kind of understanding and recognition of children's reactions and responses to what's going on between their parents, to recognizing the effects of parental conflict on children. You can see here some of the skills that get taught. Then medium term moves into forming more agreements, developing a parenting plan, decreasing arguments in front of children, putting into practice some of the knowledge and skills that was in that, getting learned in that first column. And then when you move over to that third column, that's where we start to see improved child outcomes as a result of this gain in knowledge, as a result of putting these into practice. That's where you start to see fewer and less intense conflicts between the co-parents, also associated with improved child support payment rates, decrease in lawsuits over custody and support. And this comes again from UW Extension, and the sources below if you're interested to learn more. So we are going to talk for just a minute about some resources for finding out more about the kinds of programs and services that are offered in Wisconsin and nationally. So this slide provides some information about UW Extension's co-parenting programs. So 24 county offices across Wisconsin offer classes, but there's also support for designing your program and getting it up and running. So wherever you are in the country, it could be a resource if you are at the stage of trying to launch a co-parenting program. There's also a set of resources available through UW Extension to support co-parenting electronic resources. So there's guidance for communication with co-parents, guidance for supporting a child's communication with their other parent, and then also a link here to online co-parenting classes that are recognized by the courts in Wisconsin when a co-parenting class is required by a court. National resources, we've got a set of links up here to different programs that can support co-parenting and that offer resources and best practices for service providers. Some of these resources are oriented towards parents and some towards providers. So, for example, if you look at the Successful Co-Parenting After Divorce program, and that's the second bullet, it's a free online training for families and professionals developed at Florida State University. If you go to that link, you would see resources both for parents and for providers. Similarly, the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts offers resources for providers, but then also resources that are specifically intended to be shared with families and links to other organizations that offer co-parenting guidance directed more directly to parents themselves. So a set of these programs here, including the top one, is oriented in particular towards working with young parents. So I'm going to pause here, and before we move into questions and discussion, we're going to stop on this pro tip slide and give Daryl an opportunity. He's embedded a lot of pro tips as we've been going along, but wanted to make sure that there was space for anything that you want to highlight from your really extensive experience, Daryl, that you haven't had a chance to integrate elsewhere. This would be a space to do that.
Okay, so just to remind everyone, I'm with the City of Milwaukee Health Department. The home visiting programs here at the health department include home visiting programs specifically for the moms, but the DAD project, Direct Assistance to Dads, is specifically for the father, and that's prenatally as well as the children will get support and education with the father through the program for approximately 2 years. It just so happens that if you are going to create a program like that, you really should identify men that are going to assist with developing materials, marketing, help you recruit, and also, if you can find volunteers in the early stages, help you facilitate the program, because you want to build your activities around what the men are saying are the most important things. If you're working with the moms, it's a great idea. First, a great idea to still have father-friendly materials available, and also speak early about the appropriate situation with the father. So if it's not a legal barrier or something that's going to keep the father completely out of the picture, keep the conversation open about co-parenting, as well as have an understanding and develop understanding with the mom related to the importance of fathers during child development. So making sure that some of the information from the slides are a part of it. And if you are the caseworker, make sure that you can introduce situations to the other parent that discusses what the conditions would be to make it the most ideal for the father to be included. So if there's a goal of the father being included, it's not up to us to create a barrier around it. As a matter of fact, maybe it's a conversation around employment. Maybe it's a conversation around transportation. But whatever, and it could even be a conversation about he's most appropriate to be involved with the child if you had group activities and you had food in that environment. If that's what it's going to take, then that might be a good first step. What we want to be aware of are the laws and the policies that might prevent a father from participating, because often what we find with the fathers who are not married to the mother, they still want to be connected to the child, and they express that in the future they believe that they will be with the mother. What we let our fathers know is early on, you're going to have to establish paternity. So it is a legal situation that they're involved in, and if it's not a marital relationship, then if you're going to be a non-custodial father, that's just a part of the equation. You're going to have a legal connection to the mother, but that doesn't always mean, and I know we're talking to people across the country, so this is going to vary slightly, that doesn't always mean that everything has to go through the court system in order for there to be fathers involved in the relationship and maintain a healthy bond as well as healthy development with the child. Again, I want to reemphasize that It's not just about the money. The parents would have to establish what are the clear guidelines and what are the goals of co-parenting. If it's the father who has to speak on the subject, he should be armed with the information, letting the mom know these are the types of things that I can make a contribution with. Maybe it's not money, but these are the things that are going to come out of my association with the child. You know, much appropriate discipline, higher reading levels because we're going to be reading with each other all the time. There's going to be positive physical activity and sharing so that there's engagement and ultimately social and cognitive development around that area. And during that entire time, demonstrating between the parents that there is a genuine level of respect between each other. And what we know is that if we have men who are demonstrating respect for the mom is not feeling disrespected because of their interactions, that is leading to the healthy development of the child as well as how to shape them when they solve problems too. The father, in many cultures, is known as the protector and the provider, but ultimately, if it doesn't have to be that specifically, then it still is going to be role model. So keep the fatherhood spirit going. Let the child know that they love that child. Let the mom know that the father loves that child. And even if there's other relationships that are a part of the picture, so often people will have moved on, still make sure that that does not cloud the relationship with the child. The child, whenever the co-parent is dealing with that child specifically, that child is number one. So if the child is having any type of emotional issues or separation issues, address that as quickly as possible. Don't let that become a part of the child's experience and how they remember the child. Also, it's okay, this is not a perfect science, but it's okay if the parents are able to admit mistakes because every individual situation is going to be different. This is a great opportunity for the caseworker or the home visitor or the service provider to show them here are the most appropriate ways to admit a mistake or apologize or to show that whatever was done was not supposed to be disrespectful, but this is where we can clear up the conversation. So those types of things are extremely important too. If it's all about co-parenting with one specific child, another part of the conversation that needs to be a part of what's addressed in one-on-one meetings, that's what we do in our shop, make sure to talk about responsible parenting behavior, talk about discipline, also talk about child spacing, because if the parent is not able to afford one child, it may not be the best idea to bring another child into the picture, no matter if it's with the original relationship or if it's with a brand new relationship. So we want people to make sure to demonstrate the type of behavior that's not going to cause problems in the end. I mentioned before, have a connection with a legal authority, a legal expert, because aside from paternity, there are other issues that are very specific to your local jurisdiction. So we want to make sure that if the father is going to be actively involved and it's not a 50-50 co-parenting, what would that mean? Would it make a difference in some of the things that they have to claim later when they are in a situation where they're dealing with their own parents or having their children see the other partner's grandparents? We want to make sure that men are involved and to keep them with an emotional connection. If there is financial support that they can give, we want to make sure that that continues to go on. We want the fathers to be present, and we want to make sure that if there are other benefits that exist, if there are agencies or are events, get those children to this father-daughter or father-son event. Make sure that they are appearing in these group activities. Make sure that the father lets people know publicly that they want to be engaged with this child.
Great. Thank you so much, Daryl. So as we move into questions now, we're going to start with a couple of questions that are representative of a number of questions that came in advance of the webinar. So we received a number of questions about working with families in the context of domestic violence, how to, the way to approach co-parenting when there's a history of the father being abusive toward the mother. And so a couple of things we want to say here. So first is to acknowledge that, in cases of domestic violence, ongoing contact might leave women vulnerable to further violence and threats. So depending on the situation, it may be that it's not appropriate for the parents to engage in some of the traditional approaches, so things like education classes for divorcing parents. That might not be suited when there's a high degree of risk for further violence. So in research with mothers who are trying to figure out co-parenting where there's history of domestic violence, themes that emerge, things that were really important to them, were thinking about how to manage conflict, how to set boundaries, and how to resist control. And Daryl, do you want to mention here how it's worked when you've worked with families where there's a no contact order, what that looks like?
Right. So no contact orders obviously are going to affect things like placement, and for the most part, I believe this is universal. But if there is a no contact order, then that is an action by the court that does supersede many other court activities. So let's say that you have visitation issues. You're going to have it where they absolutely are not going to have the parents see each other. You're going to have to make sure that there's conditions that are created so that perhaps the child is dropped off at a third-party location, an agency, or at a relative, and then the parents, without interacting with each other, they would pick the child up. It is a separate court action, though, and it does affect how the child is going to view the parent in the future. So those types of things are going to be taken into account when we're talking to the father about how are you disciplining the child and what types of things has the child seen as far as your relationship with the mother, and if there's any type of violence or and it doesn't even have to be physical aggression. It could be other forms of aggressive behavior. We still want to refer them out to the anger management or to batterer's intervention or to any type of treatment activity, because we still don't want them back in that environment if those behaviors are just going to keep reappearing. It's not good for anybody if it's an unhealthy person and they keep showing up in an environment. They're just going to keep polluting the water if that's the case.
Thank you. So the next question that we want to address, we also got a number of questions about if a father is incarcerated, how to support co-parenting. And so there are a couple of resources listed below, and there's one link in particular to a guide that's called Parenting from Prison, a co-parenting guide for divorced and separated parents. And so some of the tips that they offer, so first is, starting with an acknowledgement that, opportunities for involvement are constrained, but they offer guidance for the incarcerated parent about maximizing involvement through letters, phone calls, visits, and trying to maintain a positive relationship with the custodial parent. So by being supportive of their efforts and focusing on the child's needs and interests and setting aside, prioritizing that over anything that is of conflict between the parents themselves, that's part of the way that a father who's incarcerated can make the most of his opportunities to be involved with his children while incarcerated. And they also offer tips for the custodial parent. So they can support the relationship between the incarcerated parent and child by encouraging communication. So recognizing the important role that the custodial parent will play in helping the incarcerated parent maintain a relationship through regular contact. And they also talk about the custodial parent doing what they can to involve the other parent in decisions. So, recognizing that they have limited opportunities for contact, but that they can still be, they can discuss with them things like decisions about child care or, activities that the child's going to engage in, things along those lines, that involving the other parent in decisions is a way of having some continuity of involvement. At the link below, there's more information, and there's also information about specific programs that are oriented toward incarcerated parents and their parenting, so interventions like the Parenting Inside Out program. Daryl, is there anything that you would want to add about working with families in the context of incarceration?
I do. So this is an area where both co-parents are going to have a sense of patience, because depending on the age of the child, you can't really expect them to have a clear understanding of what exactly is going on, especially if there was some consistency with the father being there. So if it's the co-parenting relationship where they still want to maintain contact with the child, then again, they're just going to have to start off with a plan and have a way of following that plan. It's going to be up to the person who's incarcerated to find out what are the ways and the policies that they can connect with the child. Is it through face-to-face visitation? Is it letters? Is it calls? Is it some type of recorded messages? So they're going to have to talk to whomever are the counselors and the staff related to that. If you have people in your organization who are doing the same thing, then we want to make sure that you have a consistent contact relationship with them. In our organization, we are in contact with people approximately a month before they come out of being in an incarcerated situation. So we have an idea of what types of things they might be facing when they leave. But if at all possible, any type of photographs, any type of items that could come through a commissary, perhaps that if it's connected to a holiday, if it's connected to a birthday, something that maintains a consistent calendar relationship with the child. But also knowing, and both parents should know this, knowing that if the child is not enthusiastic, or if they're pulling away, or if they're angry, you're going to have to be okay with some of that. You're just going to have to be okay with that. You can't respond to the child's initial emotional state, especially if you can't see them. You can talk about the situation realistically, tell the truth, explain at age level how long you'll be gone or why you're not there, and be realistic about goals and expectations. Never expect too much in a situation like that, because the co-parents do not have complete control over a person being in a prison environment or incarcerated. So they're going to have to use the time constructively. Maybe there's parenting classes in that situation. That's the time to take it. Again, anger management, other adult communication, anything that is available to get that parent to make sure that they come out better, so that they're ready to engage with the family, whether they're going to be in the same household or not. If they're going to be engaging, let's make sure that they have a relationship with the child when they come out, at least.
Thank you so much, Daryl. So, this next slide has some links that are recommended resources if you're looking for more information. These top three are national. The one at the bottom is Wisconsin specific, but these are, resources that we're happy to recommend. My contact information is up here, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Dave, as I see we are now at 2 o'clock.
I think it's okay that we're at 2 o'clock, and for those of you that have to go, we understand that, but if we can stick around for another 10 minutes or so and try to get to some of the questions that have come in, hopefully we can do that. So, but I just want to note that for those folks that do have to go, I know we've got a lot of great links throughout the presentation today, so we will have a link to download the slides, so you can get at those links at the end of the webinar, but we'll also be sending that out later this week. So if you have to go, we understand. But as a first question, we've got a question from Shalonda, and she has in her city they've got a successful fatherhood group. People are the fathers are showing up and they've got good attendance, but they've tried to introduce a co-parenting aspect to this program, and they can't get the moms to show up. Have you encountered something like that? And kind of, is it more challenging to kind of bring in that co-parenting aspect there? And Tova, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So I think this is a little bit, this is the flip side of what we were talking about earlier in terms of, getting fathers to attend a program that's oriented towards mothers. So if it's starting with a fatherhood group, a piece of the work of engaging mothers is making sure that they feel like they're coming into a space that's going to be inclusive of their perspective as well. So I would think about kind of who's doing the outreach and how it's getting, how the program is getting communicated, so that they have the sense that when it comes to a focus on co-parenting that's starting with a fatherhood group, that it's really going to be respectful of the perspectives that both parents bring, and that they'll have opportunity to kind of learn and to voice, where they're coming from, and that the services are going to kind of engage them equally, respecting their roles and respecting their history and respecting, that they have different goals coming into this. So I think some of this is about, the messaging and what you're offering, and whether it starts with the fatherhood group or starts somewhere else, that all parents who you're inviting are really getting the sense that this is for them, and hearing from parents who are like them that this is worthwhile and will be respectful of them and a good use of their time. I want to give Daryl a chance to weigh in, too, if you have thoughts on engaging moms in co-parenting coming through fatherhood groups.
Yes, as a matter of fact, making sure that when the moms are going to be a part of that fatherhood group activity, maybe it can be done off-site, away from the agency, perhaps a space like the local, if you have a zoo in your community, but something that's different, and see if you can make it celebratory. So it's not even a matter of the parents have to be together, but it's just the fact that you have individuals who agree that child development and healthy child raising is the most important thing out there. So celebrate that. And that might be an opportunity to give them some tangible information. So that's where you could have your partner organizations who represent other themes within child development or within case management, have them there so they can tell them about their practices and what types of things are available in the community. They get to connect a face with the other organization and what the services are. And then also, when you're bringing people together like that, still try to make it easygoing, but also have men available for the men and women available for the women, just in case there's questions or something that goes on within the context of an activity where you just don't want to make it where it doesn't look like the needs of one supersede the needs of the other. So see if you can provide for each one.
Okay, thanks so much. So for our next question comes from Cassandra, and she's asking about sort of this distinction between, the mother and father working on their relationship versus the co-parenting part of it, and and is there an order that makes sense to approach that? Can you work on the co-parenting part if the parents aren't really getting along themselves? And you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm hoping you can speak to that a little bit more. And Daryl, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So the first part of that, and that's an excellent question from Cassandra, because we're seeing that often. The first thing that we want to make sure is that we have an idea of what do the parents see as being successful with all of this. The first part agreeing that they want a healthy, developed child who grows into a healthy adult, starting off there. Now it's a matter of how are we going to be able to do this? Is it we can do this together and this is how we're going to communicate the number of times? Again, starting off almost like a business plan where you commit to doing certain things, but not necessarily challenging the other person and saying you didn't uphold your commitment, but making sure that you call in the person and say, hey, we agreed to do this and we know what's most important and we're still focusing on the child, not necessarily rebuilding our relationship too. In the most ideal set of circumstances, because it is what the child would probably want, the child would want the parents to be together because that would seem to be the most healthy situation from them. But I'm still a proponent of the child is not going to be the one to know every single detail of what separated the parents. And so if there are some elements, and it could be it could be abuse, it could be substances, it could be a lot of different things, but principally those things should be addressed before the parents even consider getting back together. It's the things that are absolutely going to keep them apart in the end. So if you have a financial situation that needs to be addressed, maybe that needs to be addressed separately, but you can keep that part out of the conversation if the co-parents are living separately. You can keep that out of the conversation for now. The parent who needs that type of support and needs that type of treatment may need to see one of the service providers. And while they're going through this situation, the other co-parent is just letting the child know that, the other parent loves you. They still want to come around. They still are going to see you as often as possible. And I'm not going to keep that parent from seeing you, the way that as long as we agree that these things are a part of the equation and we're going to make this happen.
Tova, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, so I agree with Daryl, and I appreciate the question too. I think one thing that I would add is, for providers to be communicating to parents is that, so there may be things that they need to resolve that are between them, but that it comes back to that piece about shielding the kids from that. So, that there are kind of two separate conversations that are happening. There's other things that they might need to work out between them, and then there's the conversation about figuring out how they're going to work together in a positive way as co-parents, recognizing that, the longer it takes them to get to a place where they can, protect and prioritize their kids, that their children are suffering in the meanwhile. So, there might be some big issues that are unresolved between them, and if, for that period of time they're continuously exposing their children to it, that is much more harmful than if they're able to figure out a way to have the conversations that they need to have as adults be between them, while at the same time, setting some limits on how that gets communicated, and how they each speak to the children about the other parent, and how they engage with each other around decision making for the child, prioritizing kind of what the child needs from them. And and it's a really hard thing to do when there's a lot of tension between parents, but to the extent that parents are able to think about this from their child's perspective, I think that's where it can be most productive, is thinking about what their child needs from them, which is to hear good things about the other parent, and to see their parents being a united front, so that they're not getting mixed messages in a way that is really confusing to children.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much. And I just thought this was a wonderful presentation. I think it's going to be really valuable for a lot of folks. But before I kind of get to the final slides, I just want to give both of you an opportunity to kind of do you have a kind of a parting thought for us? Something that you want to leave us with, that you're, I'll leave it to you. And Tova, do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So first, I just want to say, big thanks to everyone who joined us today. I'm really glad that we had so many people coming together to focus on this issue, which I think is a really critical issue. And I think where I would leave you is actually with kind of what I was just saying in response to that question, which is, keeping this centered on the kids. So recognizing the value that each parent brings to the life and development of a child, recognizing that most parents, even when they are struggling with each other, really want the best for their child, and that's something that they share. So, starting from that place, and as service providers, doing what we can if we are in those roles to to recognize and value both parents, and not take the opt-out. Sometimes it could seem easier as a professional. Well, there's so much conflict between parents. If I, just work with the mother, or just work with the father, that would be more straightforward. Recognizing that conflict between parents is going to impact children, and so if we're thinking about supporting children and families, that it's really a fundamental part of this work to focus on co-parenting, since it's so important to child and family outcomes.
Okay.
And my addition, and thank you everyone for participating, my addition is everybody make sure to stay away from stereotyping. Have an idea of whether or not the father wants to be involved. If you're working specifically with the mother, actually go ahead and ask, do you talk to the father of the child? How often do you see them? Has the child ever stayed at the parent's house before? And find out as much as you can in advance. Because ultimately what might come out of it is, it's not that the father doesn't care about the child. They may not even want to be an absent father. It's not a matter of irresponsibility. It might be other things. It could be fear. It might be something cultural where they don't even have an idea of where am I going to fit in if I'm not in the same household with this child and with the child's mother. And that's all they know. Either way, they don't know what it looks like to have a father in the home, or the very opposite. They only know what it looks like to have a father in the home, and so either version of it confuses them or it causes some emotional difficulty. Be ready to have some resources to get that father to address some of those things prior to making any type of arrangements or any type of agreement that they're going to participate in co-parenting. The organization that I'm with, co-parenting with the father, 25% is co-parenting to us. I mean, if the father is around for 25%, then we want that father to be there as often as possible and get as much support as he can. And if it's a larger amount of interaction with the child or with the other co-parent, We are praising that, and we want that to happen even more. So my final words are just making sure that everybody makes it clear that if the parents want this to work, it is a priority, and we're behind them, and we're not passing judgment on this. We just want to make sure that their needs are getting met.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much. I think this is just a tremendously helpful presentation that you've given us and just on a really important topic. I also want to thank the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board for all that they did in helping to prepare and put together this webinar, and to everyone that joined in with us today.